It was the spring of 1968 when Circle Pines, a small suburban town just north of Minneapolis, found itself at the center of one of Minnesota's most enduring mysteries. Circle Pines wasn't the kind of place where people locked their doors back then. It was quiet, safe. A planned community born from post-war optimism where parents let their kids ride bikes until dusk and neighbors looked out for one another. Circle Pines itself was a vision of the future. Built in the late 1940s as a cooperative community, it was supposed to be the kind of place where modern families could thrive. Rows of ranch-style homes, neat lawns, and winding streets that curved gently instead of the grid patterns of older neighborhoods. Its slogan was "A city in the forest." People were proud of that. But on a chilly morning in May, a man walking along a wooded path near the Rice Creek chain of lakes noticed something that didn't belong among the greenery. Just off the trail, covered loosely with brush and leaves, lay the body of a young woman. She was dressed in modest clothing, a blouse and a skirt, but her shoes were missing, and there were clear signs she hadn't died peacefully. The sheriff's office rushed to secure the area, but in 1968, forensic science was primitive. The words crime scene preservation weren't yet part of a small-town law enforcement vocabulary. Still, it was immediately obvious this was a homicide. The victim was estimated to be between 15 and 20 years old. She was petite, around 5'3", with dark hair cut to her shoulders. There were signs of blunt force trauma to her skull, suggesting she had been struck repeatedly, and possible evidence of strangulation. Her clothing, though modest, didn't quite match small-town Minnesota fashion of the time. Investigators noted her blouse had more than an urban look, the kind of thing you might buy in a department store in downtown Minneapolis or even Chicago. It wasn't handmade, it wasn't passed down, it was store-bought. To some, that suggested that she wasn't from Circle Pines at all. What troubled investigators most was that no one in Circle Pines recognized her. This was a small town. People knew each other's kids, their cousins, even their neighbors' cousins. Yet, when the sheriff's office went door to door, no one claimed her. No one had seen her before. It's important to remember the context here. 1968 wasn't just any year. It was one of the most tumultuous years in American history. Protests shook cities. The Vietnam War was escalating. Even in Minnesota, communities were beginning to feel the cracks of a changing society. Hitchhiking was common, especially among young women and runaways who wanted to see the world beyond their small towns. The counterculture movement was also booming. Coffee houses in Dinkytown buzzed with students talking politics and poetry. The music of Janis Joplin and The Doors played on the radio. For teenagers with restless hearts, the world suddenly seemed wide open. But freedom also came with risk, loneliness, predators, and the dangers of trusting strangers for rides or shelter. Authorities theorized that this Jane Doe might have been a runaway, maybe from Minneapolis, maybe farther, Chicago, Milwaukee, Des Moines, anywhere within a bus ride or a thumb's hitch from the Twin Cities. That idea made sense, but it also made the investigation nearly impossible. Because if no family came forward, there was no way to match her to a missing person file. Sheriff's deputies canvassed bus depots and diners. They asked hotel clerks if they'd seen a girl checking in with an older man. Truckers along Highway 65 were questioned. Vague leads came in. Someone thought they'd seen a girl who matched her description walking along Central Avenue in Columbia Heights. Another person claimed she looked like a waitress who had worked briefly at a Minneapolis diner, but then disappeared. None of these tips ever solidified. The medical examiner confirmed she had been dead less than 48 hours when found, which meant she had likely been killed nearby. But the woods around Rice Creek were quiet, the kind of place people drove past without noticing. Whoever killed her had chosen the spot deliberately, counting on the anonymity of suburban growth and wooded backroads. Deputies noted the brush covering her body wasn't natural, it had been placed. Someone had taken the time to drag branches and leaves over her, almost as if to delay discovery, but not to truly hide her. That suggested panic, or maybe indifference. Either way, it gave detectives a chilling glimpse into the killer's state of mind. There were no fingerprints on record. Dental records were compared, but without a name, dentists across the Midwest couldn't connect her to a patient file. Weeks passed, then months. The story faded from the headlines. Unidentified girl found in Circle Pines, the Minneapolis Tribune had written. But when no new leads emerged, the press moved on. She was eventually buried in an unmarked grave in a local cemetery. Just like the Duluth torso case decades earlier, Minnesota had claimed another victim, who entered its soil without a name. Local lore says her funeral was quiet, attended only by a handful of deputies, a minister, and a gravedigger. No flowers, no headstone, just a girl laid to rest in silence. Detectives never stopped wondering. Some suspected she was a runaway, others thought she might have been passing through Minnesota on her way to California. Either way, her story ended in silence. Over the years, whispers circulated. Retired cops recalled details that never made it to the papers, like tire tracks near the scene, possibly from a dark sedan. A local hunter swore he'd seen a man and a teenage girl arguing in that same patch of woods just days before. But he couldn't give more information than the vaguest description. Some wondered if her killer was connected to other unsolved cases in the state. Minnesota in the late 1960s and early 1970s saw a wave of violent crimes against young women. Many remained unsolved. Among them were disappearances along highways, girls last seen hitchhiking, and victims found in similarly remote places. Patterns that were whispered about long before the term serial killer entered the American vocabulary. The possibility that the Circle Pines Jane Doe was part of a larger pattern has never been ruled out. In recent years, cold case units have turned to new forensic tools, DNA profiling, genetic genealogy. Her case remains unsolved, but advocates for missing persons have pushed for her remains to be exhumed, hoping that one vial of DNA might finally give her back her name. Across the US, other Jane Does from the 1960s and 70s have been identified this way, sometimes after 50 years of silence. A name discovered through a distant cousin's family tree, an answer delivered to families who never thought they'd know. Every story adds pressure to reopen Minnesota's forgotten flies. Because once you have a name, you have a story. And once you have a story, you can begin to chase justice. The Circle Pines Jane Doe reminds us of something deeply unsettling. Sometimes the greatest violence isn't the act that takes someone's life, but the erasure of their identity. A girl of 16, maybe 18, possibly 20. No one really knows. She walked into Minnesota one day and never left. She remains frozen in time, her killer never caught, her family never found, her name never spoken at the grave where she rests. And so the question lingers, hanging over the quiet suburbs of North Minneapolis. Who was she? And who decided she didn't get to grow up? Because in Minnesota, land of lakes, forests, and long winters, some mysteries are as buried as deep as snowdrifts, and the silence around them can last for decades. On the night of May 14, 2008, 19-year-old Brandon Swanson left a friend's house in Canby, Minnesota, just after midnight. It was the last day of classes at Minnesota West Community and Technical College, and Brandon had been celebrating with roommates. He wasn't intoxicated, according to friends, just a normal night. At 1:15 a.m., Brandon's green Chevy Lumina slid into a shallow ditch off a gravel road. The car wasn't damaged, but it was stuck. Brandon knew the area well enough that he thought he could direct his parents to him. He pulled out his cell phone and called home. His father, Brian Swanson, later recalled,
"He didn't sound panicked.
He just said,
Hey, Dad, I need a hand."
I'm stuck, but it's no big deal.
Brian and his wife, Annette, climbed into their pickup and headed toward Lind, a small town Brandon said was near where he'd gone off the road. But when they got there was no sign of Brandon's car. For nearly an hour, Brandon and his father stayed on the phone. The call lasted 47 minutes in total. Brian said,
"We were trying to find him."
But he kept saying,
I'm right here. I can see the lights of town. I don't understand how you can't see me.
But Brandon was wrong. His phone records later showed he wasn't near Lind at all. He was 25 miles away outside Taunton, Minnesota, near the Yellow Medicine River. Still, that night, Brandon believed he was close to home. Finally, frustrated, he told his dad,
I'll just walk. I can see the lights.
Brian, who was still driving around, stayed on the line. They talked about school, about summer plans. The conversation was calm and ordinary. Brandon didn't sound lost. He sounded like he was sure of himself. And then at 2:30 a.m. came those final words.
Oh, shh.
The line went silent. When Brian and Annette reported Brandon missing, they hit a wall. Police treated it like a runaway or a college kid blowing off some steam. Annette later testified. They told us,
He's an adult. If he wants to be missing, he has the right to be.
But we knew our son. We knew something had happened.
The next day, law enforcement finally joined the search. Using Brandon's cell records, investigators realized he had been nowhere near Lind. Instead, his last call pinged off a tower near Taunton. Deputies drove out, and there it was. Brandon's Chevy Lumina, nose down in a ditch along a gravel road at the edge of a field. It was exactly where he'd said he'd been, just not where he thought he was. Search dogs were brought in. They traced Brandon's scent leaving the car, walking along gravel roads and field edges. The trail stretched for nearly 3 miles. The scent led to the Yellow Medicine River. Dogs alerted near the water's edge, and again on the other side. Brandon had almost certainly crossed. But the river in May is no small obstacle. It's fast-moving, muddy, and cold. Authorities worried he may have drowned, yet divers never recovered a body. Even stranger, cadaver dogs later picked up Brandon's scent farther along the road, well past the river. Sheriff Bill Flatton told reporters it's like he crossed, kept walking, and then he was just gone. For weeks, teams searched every inch of farmland. Dozens of volunteers joined, some on ATVs, others on horseback. Planes scanned from above. Dogs would occasionally alert in fields or groves, but nothing was ever found. Investigators considered several theories. Drowning. Perhaps Brandon fell into the river and was swept away. But after multiple dives and years of spring searches, no remains have ever surfaced. Brandon may have crossed the river, wet and disoriented, and succumbed to hypothermia in the 40-degree night. Southwest farmland hides dangers, abandoned wells, cisterns, and sinkholes. Search teams checked dozens, but never found evidence he fell into one. Some wondered if Brandon had wandered onto private land and startled someone, but police have said there's no evidence of violence. Still, those last words, "oh shit," fuel speculation. Did he trip into the river? Did he see something? Or did someone step out of the dark? Each spring, when snow melt lowers the river, volunteers return. Some are neighbors, others strangers who learned about Brandon online. His parents never stopped searching. Brian once said,
"When you spend that much time on the phone with your son, listening to his footsteps, you don't just stop. We have to bring him home."
But as of today, no trace has ever been found. No phone, no clothing, no remains. Annette Swanson took her grief to the state capitol. She fought for new legislation to require police to immediately investigate reports of missing adults, no matter their age. In 2009, Minnesota passed Brandon's law, ensuring families would never again be told, "He's an adult, he has the right to be missing." It was a victory, but not the closure they wanted. 17 years later, the disappearance of Brandon Swanson remains one of Minnesota's most enduring mysteries. A teenager walking along a gravel road, phone pressed to his ear, his father listening to every step. A car found exactly where he left it, a trail that leads to a river and then vanishes. And those final words hanging in the silence of a dark Minnesota night. Oh shit, and nothing more. On the north shore of Lake Superior, just outside the little town of Grand Marais, is one of Minnesota's strangest natural wonders. At first glance, it looks like any other waterfall, water rushing over ancient volcanic rock, tumbling into the Pigeon River. But look closer and you'll see something that doesn't make sense. Half the water crashes downstream, joining the river as expected. The other half, it simply vanishes. It disappears into a dark, rocky hole and never comes out. Locals call it the Devil's Kettle, and for more than a century, it has baffled scientists, inspired legends, and terrified hikers who can't shake the feeling that the earth itself is swallowing whatever dares to fall in. Judge C.R. Magny State Park is a rugged slice of wilderness on Minnesota's border with Canada. The park was carved out of ancient lava flows, and the rocks here are twisted, jagged, and black, shaped by fire millions of years ago. The Pigeon River cuts through these rocks, creating rapids and falls, but nowhere is it more dramatic than at Devil's Kettle. Here, the river splits into two streams. One half tumbles down the usual waterfall path. The other slams into a pothole carved into solid volcanic rock. A turning hole about 10 feet across and disappears. Not a trickle, not a mist, just gone. If you hike there today, the trail winds through birch, spruce, and tall pines. In spring, the air smells of damp earth and thawing moss. In summer, it's thick with wildflowers and buzzing insects. And in autumn, the canopy blazes red and orange, the kind of fiery colors that make the whole North Shore feel almost otherworldly. By the time you reach the viewing platform, your legs are burning from the steep climb. The sound of the river is deafening. And then, through the spray, you see it. Half a waterfall that simply stops existing. Ever since settlers stumbled upon the falls in the late 1800s, people have been obsessed with figuring out where the water goes. Lumbermen tossed logs into the kettle, expecting them to resurface downstream. They never did. Later, hikers threw sticks, leaves, even entire car tires. Nothing came out. By the 1960s, the story of Devil's Kettle was already legendary. Locals whispered that the water might lead to an underground river, or perhaps flow directly into Lake Superior miles away. Some joked it was a gateway to hell itself. Scientists have tried to solve it the usual way. They poured fluorescent dye into the kettle. No color appeared downstream. They tossed thousands of ping pong balls stamped with phone numbers, hoping one would wash up on a beach somewhere. None did. Every test failed, and the more they tried, the deeper the mystery. With no answers, the folklore took over. Some Ojibwe elders spoke of this place as sacred, a portal between worlds, not meant to be probed or disturbed. In traditional stories, places where water vanished into the earth were thresholds, sites where spirits traveled between realms. Others say that long before the state park existed, local trappers and fishermen refused to linger there. They claimed animals avoided the spot, birds wouldn't perch nearby, deer trails seemed to curve around the kettle as though instinct told them to keep their distance. Hikers told campfire tales that if you listened closely at night, you could hear whispers rising from the hole, voices carried up from the underworld. One popular legend claimed the Devil's Kettle didn't lead anywhere on Earth, that it was bottomless, a sinkhole into eternity. Throw something in and it would fall forever. Another version was darker. The land itself was speeding, that it demanded offerings, and that's why nothing ever came back out. Parents in Grand Marais even used the story to scare their kids. Stay away from the river or the devil's kettle will swallow you whole. Over the decades, hikers reported unsettling experiences around the falls. One man swore he heard the sound of chains rattling from the kettle, though no one else could hear it. A group of campers said their dog refused to go near the water, growling and bristling as though something unseen lurked inside. Some even claimed they felt dizzy at the rail, like the hole itself was pulling them forward. Even the most skeptical hikers admit the place makes the back of your neck prickle. And then there are the stories of people who vanished near Devil's Kettle. In the 1980s, locals whispered about a drifter who tried to rappel down into the hole with a rope. He never came back up. His body was never found. The DNR has no official record, but the story has stuck around for 40 years. Others tell of late-night hikers who swore they saw pale shapes moving in the spray, not reflections, but figures. Watching them from the mist before fading back into the roar of the water. By the 2000s, the mystery of the Devil's Kettle was so famous that geologists couldn't ignore it. How could water just disappear? In 2016, a team from the Minnesota DNR used modern flow measuring equipment to finally test the river. They measured the volume of the river above the falls and then again below the falls. The numbers matched almost exactly. In other words, the water that vanishes into the kettle rejoins the river a short distance downstream, hidden from view. It wasn't magic or the devil or a bottomless pit. It was geology. The water plunges into cracks in the ancient volcanic rock, funnels underground briefly, and then merges back in with the river. And in 2017, the DNR declared the mystery solved. Here's the thing, the solution didn't sit right with everyone. Scientists had numbers, sure, but hikers who spent decades at Devil's Kettle insist it still feels wrong. The water doesn't visibly reappear. The hole chums with an almost hypnotic pull. And if the answer is so simple, why did every dye, every ball, every object tossed in never resurface? Some argue that the rock fractures are so complex, they grind objects to nothing before releasing the water. Others believe the official explanation was just a neat bow on a mystery science couldn't solve. And to this day, if you stand at the rail and look down into that swirling hole, it's hard not to feel like you're staring into something more than geology, something hungry, something ancient, something endless. Devil's Kettle Fall remains one of Minnesota's most famous mysteries. Science may have offered an explanation, but folklore doesn't let go that easily. Maybe the water does slip back into the Pigeon River, invisible to the eye. Or maybe it really does vanish into some deeper place, a place that doesn't belong to this world at all. Either way, when you're up there in Judge Magny State Park, with the roar of the falls echoing in your chest and the kettle swirling below, it's hard not to lean just a little too far over